Well, the final speaker for the motion is the columnist and political commentator. His most recent book is Voodoo Histories, in which he traces the roots of conspiracy theories. David Aaronovitch.
Thank you. Francis referred to the spies we have in the audience, and if the spies are right, then the old Salopians' whist drive can only raise one table tonight. There are a couple of Benedinians looking at each other lonely over their drinks because nobody else has turned up, and the Bullingdonians' annual art gallery trashing, which was due for this evening, has had to be postponed till next week when those of you who are due to go to it are available once more. Because I gather we are not an entirely representative audience, but it would be infra-dig of me to ask for a hands up. But one thing I will say, so we expect on this side of the argument to be forced to make a better case, frankly, than the people on the other side of the argument. And this is how we're going to do it. Is to appeal to you not to do that thing which the English upper middle class is most brilliant at, which is at voting for its own interests while disguising them as being other people's best interests. It is an absolutely brilliant feature of this segment of society that it manages to see in everything that advantages itself also everything that somehow advantages everybody else and the country. But in this particular case, it's misplaced. And I'm going to try to show you why it is that what you may conceive of as being your own interest actually does not coincide with the interest of the country. The interests of the country actually require that you and I might behave rather differently. I take into account the splendid speeches from the opposition that we've heard so far this evening, Barnaby Lennon's kind of magisterial special pleading, which I think takes special pleading to a kind of cosmic level. I particularly enjoy the call from the person in Mauritius about setting up a branch of Harrow. It reminded me of the story of the true story of the Japanese woman who was found wandering around Torquay looking for the Blue Mosque. It turned out that she'd asked at Paddington Station for Turkey and had ended up on Torquay Station and hadn't noticed the lack of an intervening continent, as you might not if you came from so far away. So it's entirely possible, actually, the person from Mauritius was wanting to set up a branch of Harrods. And if you think about it in those terms, then that misunderstanding actually works extremely well for the super wealthy of China and elsewhere, who we'll come on to in a moment. So there was Barnaby's special pleading, there was Mary Beard's own kind of boomsa-daisy charm, which is that very particular characteristic of the English upper middle class, what you might call artful artlessness. No one suffers just because we like good schools. Indeed, we are actually to be seen as benefactors, regrettably, and like the Dark Ages monastery, we keep culture alive in a time of Philistinism and so on. The only thing that slightly wrecks this for me is that my older daughter, who did go to a private school, was rubbish at Latin, and my middle daughter, who doesn't, she goes to a state school, is actually a brilliant classicist. But I mean, let that go aside. We can maybe accept that there are many good things that private and public schools do. The one that my daughter went to was absolutely tremendous school. That really isn't the issue. The issue is this: if we take an anthropological view, we step above our own interests and ask ourselves what these fee-paying schools are for. Let's define them in that way. Why do people go to them? Why did you choose to send your children to them or your grandchildren? Or why was it chosen for you yourself? Then the answer comes back, and it is Martin's answer. The function of fee-paying schools is to prevent downward social mobility. That's why you do it. You don't want your children slipping down the social order. Now, in one way, if you have an incredible increase of numbers of jobs, if you like, and careers at the top, that isn't very problematic, because everybody can have a little bit more, and the fact that your relatively mediocre children can get better jobs than their actual talents would entitle them to, as set against the generality of children, doesn't matter. But if we only need so many judges and so many QCs and so many lawyers, then effectively what you're doing is purchasing the capacity of your child to have one of those jobs as against a child from somewhere else. It's simple. I'm not saying it's an immoral thing that you do. I'm simply saying that is what it is. Strip away all the stuff about it, and that's what it comes down to. The Sutton Trust figures, the Sutton Trust, as you know, exists to look at who attends what. And one of the great ironies was hearing Barnaby Lennon use a series of Sutton Trust figures about academy members, which was actually meant as a scathing critique of the system, as some kind of great compliment of it. And I'm sure Sir Peter Lampall would have enjoyed that particular irony. Says that 70% of our judges currently come from private and public schools, 38% of politicians, 54% of journalists, up from 49% in 1986, 51% of medics, 54% of CEOs. This is against 7 to 8% of people who attend private schools overall. Overall, the top 200 schools and colleges make up 48% of admissions to Oxbridge during the 5 years, with 10% of their university entrants going on to the U2 universities. The other 3,500 schools, 3,500, that's to 200, accounted for the remaining 52%. So what we're talking about here, just to be clear, is the purchase of competitive advantage. It is not a big surprise, therefore, that the upwardly mobile Chinese middle classes should seek the same system as they seek to marry the worst aspects of their system with the worst aspects of ours, i.e. a system in which you're not allowed any degree of freedom politically, but you are allowed to have an incredibly privileged and wealthy elite. Nor is it some enormous virtue to suggest how many non-white people now attend public school. Most of us have not failed to notice that we now have some extremely wealthy Asians in this country and some wealthy other people too. It's a bit like saying it's really rather good, but in Kensington we're getting some Russians into our schools. It doesn't really tell you much about social mobility or mix. We all know that public schools, top-end private schools, are not socially mixed. However, let me show you how the competitive advantage actually works, because this is really important. First, public and private schools put up their fees in order to be able to afford always to outcompete state schools in terms of what they can pay teachers. It's an absolute fact. Just look at the figures. During the period when inflation was low during the noughties, and when there were significant amounts of additional expenditure on teachers and capital spending in state schools, between the years 2003 and 2008, private school fees went up by 43%. 43%. Why? Inflation was running about 2.5 to 3% a year. The Independent Schools Council, when asked about this, said, well, you see, it's education inflation. Education inflation. What is it? Was it the price of chalk had suddenly gone hugely up? Whatever it is they make board dusters was running out in the world and could only be kind of purchased with gold and so on. No, absolutely not. In fact, put in that way, most of the kind of actual things you needed for an education, like computers and so on, had gone down in price. Two things had gone up: the amount that teachers were being paid in the state sector and the amount of capital expenditure on buildings in the state sector. The reason why fees went up in the private sector was to maintain competitive advantage over the state sector. For that reason, nothing more. That's what educational inflation actually meant. It's what it represented.